Pioneer Institute's director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer. He's framed, commissioned, and managed over 200 research papers, 4 books, and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform. Topics including several with Pulitzer Prize-winning historians. He's been quoted in Bloomberg Businessweek, The Economist, Education Week, and the Boston Globe, and his op-eds are regularly published in the New England newspapers as well as in the Wall Street Journal, the Hechinger Report, The Hill, the Daily Caller, the Federalist, Education Next, City Journal, and the Milton Times. Not that last one. He's won the school reform awards in Massachusetts and Florida for his work on U.S. history, civic education, vocational technical schools, and digital learning. He speaks on academic standards, school choice options, and school accountability at events across the country. Mr. Gass.
So thanks, Bob, and I want to thank Kathy for inviting me and for convening this event. And it's always great to see Susan Berry. If you don't know Susan or haven't read her work, she's really terrific. I've been working with her for 10 years or so, and she is the best. She's just prolific, smart, courageous. So I just encourage you to take a look at her work. So. I'm Jamie Gass, Director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute. It's a Boston-based think tank. We've been around for about 30 years or so. We do independent, peer-reviewed research and all around education and other topics. Probably best known for the work we've done on ed reform more generally in Massachusetts, but also charter schools, voc tech schools, Metco, Catholic schooling, all kinds of private school choice. This is an important event. We are, I think, at an important time in the history of this state and the history of this country. We haven't seen an event like a pandemic for 100 years, since the 1918 flu epidemic. And the impact that this is having on all of us, but our school children in particular, is going to be profound and generational changing. And we are only beginning to fully grasp the full extent of which that is occurring. The two folks who spoke before me have kind of explained a little bit, and of course you folks know day in, day out the kind of impact that it's having on school children, but it is transforming schools in profound ways. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of the context of how we got here, not just about what it is that's going on in schools today, but what's being taught in schools day in, day out, and how we got here. So Massachusetts is fortunate in lots of regards. We are the highest performing K-12 school system in the United States, and we are the only state in the union that is internationally competitive. That is to say, we're right up there with Japan and Hong Kong and Singapore, all the high-performing countries. How did we get here? We got here back in the early 90s. There was a big ed reform law. Bill Weld and Democrats in the legislature crafted this big ed reform law. And the deal of this ed reform law was you're going to put a lot more money into the system in exchange for high academic standards in core content areas, English, math, science, and history. We were going to have teacher testing. We were going to have MCAS testing so the kids, when they graduated from high school, could read their diploma, and that they were prepared to either go to college or to work. And we developed the best performing charter schools in the United States, the ones that were the best, and all the independent research makes this clear at bridging the achievement gaps between poor and minority kids and kids in the leafy suburbs. We have the best voc tech schools in the country. All of these things were part of this grand bargain, and it really has served this state enormously well, and it has made us the envy of the country, and in some respects the envy of the world, because the reality of it is that people that have been familiar with K-12 education for 30, 40 years have known that the United States has been stuck in a lot of stagnation and decline academically. There's been a lot of worry about international competitiveness and our ability to make sure that all the people in our society have access to the educational birthright of a quality education. So there's a lot that Massachusetts got right. The problem is that when Deval Patrick was governor, there was a sea change shift. He was heavily funded by the teachers union, and the teachers union didn't like the MCAS test. They didn't like the teacher testing. They didn't like our high academic standards that weren't focusing on soft skills or self-esteem, or all the things that kind of led to stagnation and decline. But he kind of pandered to them. And the first thing that they really began to do is get rid of the school district accountability that sort of provided MRIs of school districts, so they couldn't really hold school districts accountable in the same way. They got rid of that. But the next big thing that they did was that they transitioned from these really high quality academic standards in English, math, science, and history that had made us the envy of the world and the country in terms of performance. And they transitioned to the Common Core. The outlook of the Common Core, which came out of Washington, D.C. and the Obama administration, was really towards more workforce development, sort of soft skills, and away from the high quality vocabulary, the humanities, the stories, the things that kind of bind us together as human beings. That's really what a good English curriculum does. It's having kids read Huckleberry Finn or Moby Dick or Sherlock Holmes or great poetry or great drama, because what those stories do, and human beings are the storytelling animal. That's what we do. That's what binds us together. Those stories teach us what it is that it means to be human. And it teaches people about friendship and honesty and courage, all the things that build communities, build families, and hold together a society that is not necessarily organized by a common religion or a common ethnic background or racial background. It pulls us together. And that was the secret sauce. That's how Massachusetts became #1. That's how our kids acquired the vocabulary and the language and the background knowledge so that they could make sense of the world and they could be well-educated so that they could be active participants. And again, in 2010, Massachusetts discarded those. So since that time, we've been steadily declining in our performance. We're still #1, but our performance has dropped dramatically, which not only negatively impacts all kids, but it particularly negatively impacts poor and minority students. So it's actually contributing to a spreading of the achievement gap between high-performing kids and low-performing kids. So that's the first sort of step that we've seen that has led to a much more politicized, a much more divided, much less coherent outlook towards education. The second step, and it happened around the tail end of the Obama administration, was the big push for social emotional learning. So the success in Massachusetts, and really what schools are, is they're academic institutions. They're primarily there to prepare kids to read and to write, to understand mathematics and understand how to be citizens. But when you begin to move schools, and you see this, I'm sure, in your classrooms, and you see it in your kids' report card, that there's now these social emotional criteria that are very difficult to measure. In a lot of different instances, teachers are not even prepared or trained to kind of make the psychiatric or clinical decisions that go along with this social emotional learning. The Obama administration pushed that through the Every Student Succeeds Act as they were going out the door. And increasingly, what you're seeing now is that classrooms have a more of a therapeutic outlook than an academic outlook, right? And that is damaging for a variety of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, it takes schools off of their central mission, and it helps them, they're not as able to be held as accountable because social emotional learning is just not as clear cut. As opposed to being able to write well, read well, or do mathematics or what have you. So we've got Common Core, we've got social emotional learning. Again, a lot of these are coming from Washington, D.C. The reason why Massachusetts was so successful is that Massachusetts paid for and drove all of the major decision-making related to schools that were key. The MCAS, the standards, the funding, the teacher testing, all of those things were developed here in Massachusetts. They weren't decisions that were being made out of Washington, D.C. Increasingly through things like Common Core, increasingly through things like social emotional learning. The decisions are really being made out of the control of your state legislature or your governor. They're really just kind of passing down policies that are coming from Washington, D.C. And sort of the third feature we got here, and of course it's playing itself out every single day, is the decline of history and civics in our schools. If you go back to the founding era, you go back through the 200-plus year history of this country, the whole point of schooling was to drive and serve as a wellspring for our republic. That is to train and educate citizens to be participants in their society. The original Ed Reform law that Massachusetts had in 1993, and it was written right in the law, and it was very clear. Kids need to be taught about the founding documents, the Federalist Papers. They need to learn about state history. They need to learn about labor history. They need to have a broad, wide understanding of what it means to be an active and informed and knowledgeable citizen. Well, if you had to guess one of the, we have an MCAS test for English language arts, and we have an MCAS test for math, and we have an MCAS test for science. The one area that after 25 years, and we're spending about $10 billion annually in Massachusetts at the state and local level to support education, the one test that they never put in there was the U.S. History MCAS test, even though that was the primary focus from the beginning of this state, going back to 1780, is to educate kids to be citizens. They never implemented the MCAS test. They still haven't implemented the MCAS test. They don't have any design to implement the MCAS test for civics or history. They also got rid of the really high, like they did with Common Core and like they did with the science standards, they discarded in 2018. Governor Baker allowed the Board of Education and the Department of Education to get rid of our high quality, very traditional history standards. So what's in these history standards? Well, founding documents, knowledge of the Civil War, knowledge of the abolitionist movement, figures like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, the founding fathers, Frederick Douglass, Abigail Adams, and all the kind of figures that shape and drove our country and allow kids to have the background knowledge so that when they vote or they are participating in our society, that they know the basic vocabulary of what a governor does, or what a state legislature does, or what the president does, or the Congress does. These are all the kinds of things that were included in those previous really high quality history and civic standards that we had in Massachusetts. Well, they discarded that, and what did they do? They added in what they call action civics, or they call service learning. There's a lot of different names for it, but really what it does is drives a much more politicized, less objective view of our country. It really tries to turn kids into little community organizers. And in fact, I'll give you an example from of what I've seen. For example, have a kid read 5 essays about how we should get rid of the Electoral College, and then ask the kid to write their opinion about whether we should keep the Electoral College, right? Or ask the kid to participate in some kind of local community organization from a preferred list of organizations. None of them are ones that offer much of a variety of sort of political or ideological differing points of view, etc. So the classrooms increasingly are not just teaching the basic history of the country or what binds us together or how to be citizens, but how to be politically active. And the problem with that, there's nothing wrong with kids being politically active or knowledgeable, but they have to have the background knowledge first. They've got to be able to understand what it means to be a citizen. They have to understand the history of the country so that they're not just being, having this kind of written on them by their teachers or a larger political agenda. So anyway, Common Core, social emotional learning, a much more politicized view of history. That's where we got here. That's, I think, what people are seeing over the last couple of years as we've been deep into the pandemic. We've seen, and I think parents across the country and across the state are seeing this, and now they're getting more and more outrage, and they're more concerned about what it is that they're seeing their kids being taught. So, the good news is that, as folks who have spoken before will tell you, People are getting better informed. It's events like these. It is reaching out to your politicians. It's running for office. It's doing all the things necessary, because we know what it is in Massachusetts that has worked. And we know, I think, have a general sense of what it is that kids need in order to live fulfilling lives and to be well educated so they can be citizens. And now it's just a question of, as we're coming out of the pandemic, people re-engaging and reminding ourselves how it is that the state has got to be such a high performer. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.